same route, BNSF, 4 different commodities, grass seed, lumber, pulp, and paper. Because of the rate, the grass seed fuel surcharge is $469, whereas the paper fuel surcharge is $849, which represents an 87% increase for the movement of the same product through the same origin to the same destination in exactly the same kind of car. Now, Peter and Paul is an interesting theory that we've kind of espoused here, and it's been talked about a little bit earlier today, but we'd like to elaborate on it if we could. Some customers are not charged fuel surcharges, and that's been clearly pointed out because they have contractual arrangements with railroads which preclude the application of fuel surcharges. That's all well and good. That was a commercial decision made by the parties long time ago. And to charge Peter to pay for Paul, we think is wrong, unfair, and unreasonable. Differential pricing is permitted in rate making, as Staggers clearly pointed out, but not in the application of fuel surcharges. And carriers should be held accountable to the commercial choices and decisions that they've made. And one shipper should not be required to make up for the difference in another shipper. The board should not be a place where the carriers can come and say to you, gee, we can't collect this because of a commercial arrangement that we, by the way, signed, and we hope that you would make that up for us. There's some significant gaps in the world of fuel surcharges, too, and this has been pointed out today. One of the questions earlier to the panels was what data is needed. It's difficult to understand the data that's out there in the carrier's report. Fuel can well be fuel that's used for moving auto cars and for trucks moving around hauling parts and people to support the rail operations, as well as the fuel that's used to haul freight cars. And what we're talking about here is the fuel that's used to haul freight cars. We agree with everyone else that hedging should not be a component of this discussion, and there's virtually no data at all in the waybill sample that would allow you to really understand the fuel cost application that's in the approaches that the railroads take. We believe clearly, as Mike McBride pointed out earlier, and I'm sure he'll echo again in a few minutes, that the board has clear jurisdiction in this area. This is clearly pointed out in the statute, and the ICC history is fairly clear on that subject. And I'd like to ask Kurt to kind of wrap things up.
Okay. Basically, we feel there are 2 key actions which the board should take. One, you should order carriers to provide better and more complete fuel cost data. And secondly, you should order each carrier to undertake a review of the fuel surcharge methodologies being used today, taking into account principles established in this hearing, and further to have the carriers report back to the board the results of those findings within 90 days of the board's order. So, just to wrap things up here, I guess if I could pretty much summarize what all the shippers that you've heard from so far have asked for. I mean, basically what we're asking for is fairness, transparency. The board has asked earlier today for a recommended fuel surcharge methodology. John has indicated one is in our proposal. Got copies here if you need them. And I guess I'd just like to wrap up by again saying thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and thank you for having this hearing. It's a very important issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. McBride.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, I am standing in for Chuck Linderman of EEI this afternoon, who was summoned away to deal with the difficult coal supply situation that the industry is facing, and which has been given the highest attention, as you may be aware. I also wanted to take a moment, since I won't use the full 10 minutes, since I'll be speaking for both of us, to say that I became aware during the hearing, Mr. Chairman, about the very sad news about one of your key staff members. And I wanted to just say he's a friend, and he is in our thoughts and prayers, and I wish you would convey to his family the same sentiments that you did on behalf of the board to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Edison Electric Institute, as I'm sure you know, is the Association of the Investor-Owned Electric Utility Industry. Electric utilities, as you've heard today, actually have a higher percentage of their total costs in fuel than do the railroads. It would therefore be hypocritical to oppose cost recovery on the part of the railroads, and obviously we do not. And like all the other shippers, whether regulated or unregulated, no one wants to stand in the way of the railroads being able to recover their costs. That said, the railroads are in a unique situation The utilities, like other regulated companies, have to answer to their regulators about what their actual fuel costs are. And as you heard some explain to you already today, fuel costs are treated entirely separately from the underlying rates and are looked at separately by the regulatory bodies. And no utility is ever allowed to recover more than its fuel costs in the course of those separate fuel proceedings. We think that's not just fair, that's reasonable, and that's the law, and that ought to be the law here too. Now, the railroads also like to say, if a contract ever works out in their favor, which sometimes they do, contracts sometimes work out in one party's favor, sometimes in the other, that a deal is a deal. And we think that's right. We think that's the law. And so if they're under-recovering on their contracts, a deal is a deal, and the rest of the shippers shouldn't have to pay for that. There are even railroads that have come before the board and informed the board that demand exceeds capacity on certain lines. Well, unless they're being irrational, and they're not, the only possible way that that could be true is if the rates are being held down because of contracts. So that should not be the burden on the rest of the shipping community. In any event, as to the law, I just want to supplement a few of the points that I made earlier for Total. The statute is clear that if an unreasonable practice is involved instead of a rate, you do not have to find market dominance. And therefore, you would not have to proceed rate by rate, making the kind of determinations that you do. You could take action of a more generic nature, and I think that's what you're hearing the shipping community say to you uniformly. Take some action of a uniform nature that is reasonable to the railroads and reasonable to the shippers. Now, in terms of authority, by the way, may be interesting to know, in addition to what I told you earlier, that when Congress recodified the Interstate Commerce Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act in 1995, it repealed a provision of the then existing statute, former section 10707AH, which read, "The authority of the Commission to determine and prescribe rules, classifications, and practices may not be used directly or indirectly to limit the rates which carriers are otherwise authorized to establish under this subtitle." It is not permissible to assume that Congress engaged in a futile act, and therefore you must presume that Congress intended something by repealing that provision. And I submit that is consistent with the argument that I made previously, that when railroads call surcharges something other than rates, when they charge separately for them, when they say their rules or practices, and Congress has said to you, you have authority to act without going through the market dominance and complex rate-making determination that otherwise constrains your authority. Congress did not constrain your authority with respect to rules and practices. So what we would have then, if we were to proceed on the basis of some more agreed-upon index, such as your rail cost adjustment factor, many of us have spent much of our careers getting that index just right. You started in 1977. It wasn't until 1992 that the courts finally blessed the RCAF as it exists today. It's got fuel in it. It's a forecasted index. It's got productivity in it. The railroads prepare the data and submit it to the board. The data is out there for everyone to see. No one has explained to me, and in any of the railroad filings that I've seen, there is no explanation why the RCAF would not be a fair mechanism, a reasonable mechanism, since you yourselves publish it, for determining a presumptively reasonable recovery of fuel costs. And any other recovery of fuel costs should therefore be considered at least suspect and subject to challenge before you, because by definition, it is not, therefore, an adjustment taken in accordance with the mechanism that you have determined as a board and published quarterly as the proper mechanism under the statute for recovery of costs. I think I'll conclude there and leave you the additional minutes that I otherwise would have taken, but I'd be happy to answer any of your questions, of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schick.
Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey, I'm Tom Schick. I'm with the American Chemistry Council. We're also pleased to be here today to talk about this important matter. ACC has also submitted as part of its filing in this docket the testimony of Tom O'Connor and Kim Hillenbrand from Snavely King, but they are on panel 4, and it was deemed by the board to leave them on panel 4, so I look forward to their addressing some of the more technical matters later this afternoon. ACC's membership, and we've had 2 members here testify in the earlier panel today, but ACC's membership as a whole accounts for about 85% of the chemical products, including plastic products, that are produced in the United States. Our members depend on the railroads in this country for safe, secure, and efficient transportation of about 170 million tons of traffic and provide more than $5 billion in annual revenue to the railroads. Chemicals are the second largest commodity carried by rail in the United States. ACC's position on this docket is that indeed railroad fuel surcharges are not reasonable practices under Section 10702, Part 2, and we ask the board to exercise its authority, and we have no doubt you have that authority, to remedy the flaws in the way that the rail carriers have been calculating and applying those fuel surcharges. Underlying all of this, and I think we've heard a lot about it today, is that a railroad's ability to engage in unreasonable practices is based on an absence of effective competition for much of the traffic that our members move by rail. Not all, but much of the traffic. And some of our members have testified about that on the previous panel. At 63% of the chemical manufacturing plants operated by our members, there's only one rail carrier. That kind of market power is enhanced beyond the plant when the destination is captive, even if the origin point is not. We ship products by all modes of transportation. And in the other modes, of course, there are fuel surcharges. But those are subject to negotiation, and they're subject to market forces. What we have here is, in many instances, an absolute inability to negotiate, or to kind of take it or leave it, as people have described it earlier, in this application of fuel surcharges by the railroads. As Mr. Posick said earlier, we've got costs for energy too. Chemical manufacturing, plastic resin production are very, very energy intensive. We'd like to be able to get that back and passing it along. I think there was a question to Ms. El Hakim. No, we cannot always pass every penny of it along. We'd like to, but we can't. So you have to keep in mind that you're dealing with a practice in an industry where there's a lack of competition between a service provider and the customer to begin with. From our point of view, there are 5 aspects to this. John, could you hit the next and final slide here? This just summarizes the written testimony which we have submitted. I'll go over a couple of the highlights on that, and then we can get on to the questions. First of all, as many, many folks have already talked about, fuel surcharges as applied by the railroads are not based on the actual fuel consumption. ACC has no quarrel with the concept of fuel cost recovery, but it clearly has to be related to what the cost of fuel is. That should be related to something that has something to do with moving traffic, like distance, weight of the shipment, gross tons, gross ton miles, tonnage, car loads, car miles, something like that. Maybe the grade, the uphill, the downhill, as you talked about on the previous panel as well. But it has to have to do with something that has something to do with costs. Snavely King will address some of this on panel 4 when they come up. They've looked at this closely at our request. The second point on our list of 5, and I guess everybody's got either 4 or 5 points here today, the ones who put the slides up, is that it's inappropriate for a fuel surcharge to be linked to the freight rates. So much has been said about that, and so much has been said about the components that go into freight rates, whether it's non-fuel costs or whether it's other elements, that I think I'm going to leave that one alone and turn to the third point. The third point is that higher fuel costs are also being recovered by other means. We've had a good discussion today about the rail cost adjustment factor. We've had a discussion about contracts being renewed, about new tariffs being published or new prices being put out there. And it is really stretching anyone's belief to think that these rates haven't changed since 2001 or haven't been encompassing at least some of the fuel surcharge. So we would say that a new freight rate shouldn't be subjected to a surcharge unless subsequent to that rate coming out, there's another unanticipated increase in fuel costs, and it should be triggered at that point and not accumulated up. No portion of a fuel cost should be recovered twice from any shipper. Again, Snavely King, Mr. O'Connor will talk about that on the fourth panel, but we want to be sure that you understand, aside from the calculations and recommendations he's made, that as a matter of principle, we think this is incredibly important. The fourth point on our list, this is what Nittlig referred to as robbing Peter to pay Paul. You shouldn't be having some shippers overcharged on fuel surcharges or applying a higher fuel surcharge to those shippers who are subject to it simply because commercial decisions leave other shippers immune from a fuel surcharge. Again, we're not quarreling with the concept of a fuel surcharge, but we don't quite see how captive customers or other customers should be asked to pay for a shortfall that has nothing to do with the traffic that they're asking to be moved. The recovery of unanticipated, and we keep coming back to unanticipated fuel cost increases is an admirable objective for any company. We don't quarrel with that from the railroads. But it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that they will recover, let alone over-recover, the fuel surcharges. The final point, and this is another one we've talked about a lot today, is transparency. We really need transparency. And I think that this is something which goes to the heart of what the STB can do under its supervision of the railroad industry. As someone said earlier, Mike, it might have been you, there is no other forum. Nobody else has authority to look at these kinds of issues except for the STB. So what have we heard here? And you'll see it if you look at the testimony that we submitted and in others. We have people analyzing filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, but not quite getting all the way to where they need to get. We have people looking at the waybill sample, but of course the waybill sample doesn't really break out the fuel surcharge. We have people looking at the R1 data that are submitted to the STB, but not quite being able to close the gap. We have shippers making examples or anecdotes or calculations or being asked to submit further ones or putting them up on the screen here, but that doesn't quite do it. We have people looking at financial analyst reports and what can the financial analysts put together to see what the effect of fuel surcharge is. We have people reading articles in the Wall Street Journal. We have all kinds of things going on here, but the one thing we don't have is we don't have a single central place where the data is collected. It's collected in an authoritative manner from the railroads by the government, and it's put out there for everybody's use, as it would be by a Public Service Commission looking at a fuel surcharge for an electric power company. I think it's incumbent on the board, ACC thinks it's incumbent on the board, to create a set of transparent data and then to have that available to everybody so these things can be assessed. There's no one else who can do it. So in conclusion, yes, you have authority. There's no question you have authority. We ask you to remedy the problems in the railroad fuel surcharge practices. They differ from railroad to railroad, but we think you have authority to take a look at that and to fix that. I look forward not only to panel 4, where there will be some discussion of the details of this, but I'm also looking forward to the railroad panel to see what the railroads have to say about all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McBride, I listened very carefully to your comments, testimony. It sounded at one point during your comments that you think it would be a perfectly reasonable approach for the board to just simply say, we're not going to have fuel surcharges anymore, they're an unreasonable practice, and we're just going to let the railroads put everything in the rate. Is that an accurate recapitulation of what you said?
I think you could do that. I don't think that's the only thing that is appropriate. There are other ways to deal with the problem, but there is an RCAF out there, and so if they're not taking RCAF increases, you could be saying at the same time that we think it would be far more reasonable, accurate, and transparent for the railroads to take RCAF increases unless their contracts require something else, and if they require something else, it's off the table and outside your jurisdiction anyway. But if you take the RCAF increases, those are presumptively reasonable and we won't hear anybody complain about them. If you take anything else, we're not going to tell you you can't take a fuel surcharge. But what we are signaling is that we'll entertain complaints if the shippers can prove that the surcharges do indeed double dip, over recover, or otherwise inaccurately compensate the railroads for their fuel costs. Because what you have in front of you, think about it this way. You have an RCAF that is based on railroad data that your staff scrubs and applies a productivity adjustment to and puts out for everyone to see every quarter. And we can fight about it if we have to, and we rarely do anymore because you've got it down to a science. Nobody could say that about the fuel surcharges. We don't have that transparency, we don't have that data, and they're not all the same. And they're not even based on off-highway diesel. Not a single railroad that I know of uses as its surcharge the fuel that they use. And you've heard about that this morning. And I can assure you, having represented the petroleum industry on this, that when the ultra-low sulfur diesel for on-highway use comes in the fall, their costs are going to go up to make it. But the railroads aren't going to be subject to that for the off-highway diesel for several more years, 2012 I believe it is. So almost by definition, since they're using something other than what they burn, their fuel charges are at least suspect. They ought to be challengeable. I mean, it's as if they're using the price of bananas. It's only a coincidence if what they're using to rely on for their fuel surcharges compensates them in an accurate manner for their fuel costs.
Mr. Ficker, you look like you have something you might want to say.
Well, I think there's an important point that Mike just made, and this, I'm not near as articulate as Mr. McBride and his fine legal talent that he displays here in front of this agency. But there's a couple of things that have gone on. We, as you know, have sat with you and explained the proposals that we took. We believe the proper solution to this is for the railroads and the shippers to come down and work something out. But we've tried. We spent a year and a half talking to the rail carriers, showing them our proposal, and our proposal dealt with off-highway diesel price that's published every week by the same energy information agency that publishes the on-highway diesel, and it's clearly much more aligned with the cost of the fuel that the railroads consume. So we believe that's an appropriate approach as well. We stand ready and willing to sit down and work with the railroads today, right now, to come up with a more equitable, transparent, fair, reasonable approach to fuel surcharges. We don't object to the concept. Most of the rates today from the majority of our members are market-based rates that are probably not subject to your jurisdiction because they've been exempted over the last many years. So the reality that we're facing is the need for shippers to be able to say, I can see how this cost happens, I can justify it for my organization, and I accept it as it is, because there's no negotiation on fuel surcharges today. It's a take it or leave it thing. You want this, you want to move your goods, here's the price, and oh, by the way, you will pay a fuel surcharge, and we'll publish that arbitrarily without any discussion with you whatsoever.
Any rebuttal?
No rebuttal. I just want to say that if you think about it this way, you might just put the question to the railroads very simply. How could it be unfair to you if we said that you can take RCAF increases and those would be presumptively reasonable, but that anything else is subject to challenge before the board?
Mr. Ficker, historically, fuel surcharges were allowed to be implemented carefully, infrequently, without constant change, and only temporarily in response to emergencies. Which of these factors would you say are present today?
All of the above.
Are present?
Many of the above are present. Vice Chairman Mudd, would you go through that list again? Because you went through it pretty quick. You've got it written down, and I don't.
Well, what I said was historically, fuel surcharges were allowed to be implemented infrequently, carefully, without constant change, and only temporarily in response to emergencies. Which of those characterize today's railroad fuel surcharge?
Everything but the first one. I think you said infrequently. They've been frequent. We've had them in place now since about 2001, and the study that we attached to the our written testimony clearly points that out. They should be allowed to exist to compensate for that aberration, not the fuel costs. And what gets mixed up in this dialogue, and I've heard it seen in written articles and in dialogue and in hallway conversation, is, oh, we're not recovering our cost of fuel. That's not what a fuel surcharge is intended to do. It's intended to recover the extraordinary cost, as we pointed out, of fuel. You have a rate structure that's meant to recover your fuel costs. And there isn't a railroad that I'm aware of that doesn't look at their cost structure when they're making rates as well as market conditions before they publish a rate for a user.
It's been alleged that some firms pay no fuel surcharges at all because of their contracts. But it's also been indicated that some firms pay no fuel surcharges because the railroads feel they would lose the traffic if they levied fuel charges on them. It's say very intermodal competitive traffic. Do any of your members not pay fuel surcharges who don't have them precluded by contract?
I'm not aware of any, Vice Chairman. I could assume that might exist, but from what I've been in contact with members for the last 2 years on this subject, very few members that I know of escape a fuel surcharge regardless of their transportation characteristics.
Mr. Schick, is it true that high transportation rates are moving chemical industry jobs offshore, especially rail transportation rates?
I would agree with the first part. High costs are moving chemical industry jobs offshore. I will not say to you that I can point to, with one exception, that I can point to it being caused by, there are many factors, labor costs, energy costs. Energy costs are a huge factor for the chemical industry, and various other factors, including rail cost is one of them. I can't say to you that it's because of rail costs alone or of rail surcharges alone, but there's no question, and I think Ms. El-Hakim covered this when you asked a comparable question that was company specific to her, and obviously I'm not speaking for any one company, but it does grind down into the company and have to make decisions about what's going to be done. There's an interaction here. Interestingly, I'm sitting next to Mike, and he's representing the electric industry. There's a huge interaction here. When the fuel surcharge is applied to coal traffic, drives up the cost of electricity. Electricity is a very, very large factor in chemical manufacturing. So we're paying for it there as well. That also forces utilities to burn more natural gas, either because the cost of coal goes up or because of the unavailability of coal. In some cases, there have been shortfalls in the amount of coal delivered from the Powder River Basin. When the cost of gas is driven up, that drives up not only our electric costs, but it also drives up the cost of the gas that we use as fuel, and particularly as well as in feedstocks. So, I mean, these fuel surcharges are hitting us in our chemical sector a couple of times over, just the fuel surcharges themselves.
Do you feel that the current RCAF formula is currently being used to cover all the extra costs of fuel to the railroads, or is it partially recovering it and the railroads are trying to get the rest of it through the fuel surcharges, or is the fuel surcharge almost purely a markup over the cost of fuel?
It's hard to tell exactly how that plays out, Vice Chairman. One of the things that I think is important to point out, and we point this out in our written testimony, the fuel surcharge approach began as a small increment. It began as a couple percentage points, and the ease of application was, let's just apply it to the freight bill. Here's the freight bill. It's $1,000. We're going to charge you 1% more. You're going to pay $1,010. And it was pretty simple. But what's happened is those numbers have risen. This whole situation has just gotten out of control and out of hand. The railroads could have very easily, when the price of fuel started to hit at $35 and $45 and $50 a barrel, said, hey, we see there's a problem here, we'll adjust this, and I would bet a lot of money we wouldn't be having this hearing today because the issue would have been dealt with. They had that opportunity. We took that opportunity with them to point this out and urge them to adjust accordingly. But they felt it wasn't in their best interest to do that. And I have, you'd have to ask them, and I'm sure you will when they're here, why they've done that. So the real issue is we had a situation that grew from a need. The need was left unchecked and wasn't adjusted to deal with the times as the situation migrated forward. And that's what we're urging you as an agency to take care, or to direct the carriers to work with us on solutions. Because I still believe, firmly believe, that working together with the rail industry, we can provide a reasonable approach, transparent approach, and a fair approach for everyone.
Well, we hope so, too. I have one final question, and that is that you point out that the railroads did not act immediately when costs began to rise, and then they began to institute the fuel surcharges. And to some extent, the fact that the fuel surcharges are increasing more than the price of fuel has increased from the time they instituted it reflect to some extent that there's a catch-up going on here, that they were trying to catch up some of the increase that took place before they instituted the surcharges?
That graph that we had shown earlier shows they're clearly compensating.
Overcompensating from the base, however, but if they're
Right,
trying to
but
compensate
I think they've
beyond that,
overcompensated clearly from going backwards. Now, again, the whole question becomes, are you recovering your cost of fuel or the extraordinary increase in the cost of fuel? A very, very important distinction, and one I'm sure that you fully understand and fully appreciate. And our goal here would be to overcome that, recognizing that there's some, because of the commercial decisions made by both parties, that they're not going to recover that on. And that's appropriate.
Mr. Vice Chairman, in further response to your earlier question to Mr. Ficker about the way the index works, there are two aspects of this that we need to break apart so you'll understand. The answer to your question is as follows. The RCAF, by definition, must recover the exact cost of the fuel that the railroads incur because it has the following feature. They forecast the fuel for the upcoming quarter, as was previously explained to you, and then on an after-the-fact basis, it builds in a forecast error adjustment that the board applies to correct for any forecast errors 2 quarters hence. So on the fuel price itself, it works out over time to exactly recover for the fuel prices. There is, however, a separate aspect of the index that may require another look, and that is that the index is periodically reweighted. And fuel is a portion of the railroad's total cost. There was a time when it may have been 5 or 6 or 7%. It grew to 10%, I believe, and it's probably higher now.
it's 12% right now.
12%. And so if the weights in the index are less than the 12% figure, assuming that to be correct, that you just provided,
I'm sorry, it's 20% right now. The railroads estimate their cost. It's 12% in the index.
in the index. Well, then, by definition, the index may need reweighting. The agency has reweighted periodically, but on arbitrary time schedules of 2 or 5 years since it's been in existence, and it may be appropriate to consider a prompt reweighting of the index so that fuel is not under-recovered as a portion of the total cost. And you heard Mr. Crowley explain you could then publish even monthly if you had any further concerns. It may be difficult to reweight monthly, but in principle you ought to be able to reweight more frequently, and I don't hear any principled objection to doing that.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman Mulvey, I just want to add that in terms of the RCAF, I certainly agree with what Mike and what John have just said. I think we would agree with that completely. In terms of this mismatch, and I hope there's nobody left in this room who misunderstands the question of recovering fuel cost versus recovering that incremental unanticipated fuel cost. Our consultant will discuss with you the fact they think the over-recovery was at $900 million cumulatively to date, and that's not even a complete number because of some of these data difficulties they ran into. There were other slides and graphs that were shown today. So this is a very important issue, and going forward it should be done with something like the RCAF. I want to share with the board, one of the member company folks, after looking at the draft of ACC's testimony, said, very nice testimony, says all the points that we wanted to make, but where's the sentence asking for the refund of the overcharge? And I said, no. I said, I had read the board's order, and this is not a rate case, and we were not going to ask you to refund the money. We certainly do respect that. On the other hand, when you think about it, and no matter how much the amount is, and I know the railroads have infrastructure needs, and we're very cognizant of that, and we want them to be able to invest in their infrastructure because we are so dependent on them. On the other hand, I can't believe that they expected to fund their entire infrastructure or an important component of their infrastructure out of a fuel surcharge on an unanticipated event that might never have come to pass. I mean, certainly they have other ways of making rates and other ways of obtaining revenue than to do it through this mechanism, which has these flaws that we've talked about today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. McBride, I don't want to get the cart before the horse here, but there was a suggestion made earlier in the testimony that if the board decides it wants to take this record and take some kind of regulatory action, that regulatory action should be couched in terms of a rulemaking proceeding under the APA. Is that what do you have a position on that, or do you have views on that you would share with us?
Well, if you are going to take action with respect to the RCAF, I think you would be obliged to do that. because you do publish it, and you publish it in accordance with regulations, and so you would have to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking to change those regulations. If you were to issue a policy statement, which you're permitted to do, of course, you could issue a policy statement without having to engage in a rulemaking proceeding. I think the one thing you can't do is adjudicate today, or on the state of this record, somebody's actual rates or fuel surcharges. Those would have to be the subject of a separate proceeding. It just depends on, in the first two instances, however, how you choose to proceed. And I think you have great latitude to proceed either in a rulemaking with respect to the RCAF or any other rules, or to issue a policy statement.
Thank you very much. We will next turn to the railroad panel. We will have the railroad witnesses appear individually and not as a panel. Excuse me, I didn't mean to use the word panel. Vice Chairman Mulvey and I will be asking questions as we have in the other situations of the witnesses. The first witnesses will be with BNSF Railroad Company. So we'd ask them to come forward, please. We'll take the railroads one at a time.
I'm Tom Hund. I'm the CFO with BNSF. Do you want me to just stay in the center here? Or?
Just stay right there in the center.
All right.
We need to get you an appropriate name.
Well, that's
name
fine.
tag.
John's is down there, but I'll just start. Yeah. You tell me when you're ready.
John is not here, I presume.
No, we notified the board several weeks ago that John
Yeah.
has a customer commitment
Yeah.
today. As CFO, I'm speaking for the company.
Okay, good. Trying to get our technology act together
Actually,
here.
none of those. Tom Hund.
It's on, Tom, but it's...
Have you got us?
Yeah, we're on, but there's something disconnected. I'm afraid
It's not. Okay.
Just so the people in the room will know how this order is going to work. BNSF will be first, and then Canadian National, then Canadian Pacific, then CSX, then Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific. That's the order in which we will take these. It appears it's alphabetical order. So let us know when you're ready, or you may.
It's on the screen here, sir. It's not coming up. Do you want to...
Technology is wonderful when it works.
Concern is the CSX one was up there during part of your last panel. It shouldn't have been. I think something went haywire.
Okay.
You're in the desperate position of two lawyers trying to figure out how to fix the computers.
That could be interesting.
Is there a different button we should be pushing?
Is Tom or whatever his name is?
Someone said F7.
Yes, it's
F7.
F7. It should be F7.
There you go.
Very good.
And in advance.
We can do the weather forecast, maybe.
Some cream, thanks.
Heaven forbid we have a presentation without a PowerPoint. That
we
would
have
be.
we have technical help, yeah. Tech has arrived. This is the button saying on.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
If all else fails, we have this.
Okay, great.
Real paper.
You do have the hard copy.
Paper industry
also.
would be
That's
happy
terrific.
to know we have real paper.
And I
Okay,
guess
let's-
it aids all the technicians are lawyers. Is that what
Okay.
Okay.
Are we ready, Mr. Hunt?
We certainly are.
Thank you very much. You're welcome to proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Buttry and Vice Chairman Mulvey. I'm Tom Hund. I'm the CFO with Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and I appreciate you providing me with the opportunity to speak on this important topic for BNSF. So let me address a few key points of our fuel surcharge program. First of all, the objective of the BNSF fuel surcharge program is to recover the increase in fuel expense. And the fuel surcharge program is in response to the high cost of fuel and also the high price volatility. The fuel surcharges are common in many other types of industries, such as steamship lines, utilities, trucking, barges, and even as was published in the Wall Street Journal last week, we've got lawn services and pizza delivery companies instituting fuel surcharges. The next slide shows that from 2001 to 2005, fuel expenses increased approximately $1.5 billion, which is a compounded annual growth rate of 25%. And this is more than 4 times the rate of increase in all of our other expenses during the same time period. This slide illustrates 3 points. First, fuel has been steadily rising. Second, the price of fuel is very volatile. And third, there is a high correlation between highway diesel fuel prices and BNSF's cost of fuel. And the biggest difference between the highway diesel fuel and the BNSF cost is taxes. And we use the highway diesel fuel as the fuel surcharge program benchmark because it's a widely accepted public statistic. But several have claimed that by using highway diesel fuel, we're over-recovering as opposed to our own cost. And this is not correct, as we're measuring the change over time. And unless the spread between the two prices widens significantly, which it's clearly not doing on that graph, there's no over-recovery occurring. And let's talk about our hedging program, because that's come up through a number of people's discussion today. And as it says in the headline of this slide, hedging is independent of fuel surcharge. Hedging is a cost containment strategy, a risk containment strategy, where you lock in a future price or a future range of prices. It's like purchasing insurance and deciding what your deductible should be and what your limit should be on your property insurance policy. But there is no free lunch. And as shown on the bullets up there, if prices rise, you win. If prices fall, you lose. And in 2005, our fuel expense was reduced by 21% due to hedging. However, in 1998, when fuel prices were low, our fuel expense was actually increased by 13% due to hedging. And we, in 1998, did not receive any compensation from our customers for that increase in fuel expense and therefore shortfall in profitability relating to our hedging activities. And finally, many of our customers are in commodity businesses, and they're clearly familiar with hedging strategies. Well, let's get into the details of the actual surcharge program. The history of our program, and this is before the mileage-based program, which started this year, was that the truck fuel surcharge program is widely accepted and recognized. And we originally used a percent of freight bill primarily because it was easy to administer. And the entry point was adopted based on historical average cost of highway diesel fuel, which, as we saw earlier, has a high correlation to BNSF's price per gallon of the diesel fuel we consume. And finally, BNSF charges a lower percent of the freight bill than the truck surcharges. Well, starting in the first of this year, we moved to a mileage-based program for certain groups. And let's talk about that, because there's been a lot of commentary today about that program. Now, first of all, a mileage-based program reflects fuel usage. And the tables are built on a business unit by business unit basis for fuel intensity. And the mileage table is based upon rail miles. And the intent of our mileage-based program is to only recover our cost above threshold and align the surcharge with fuel consumption. The mileage-based program was initiated for non-interline traffic for coal and agricultural commodities on January 1st, 2006 as a response to our customer concerns. Interline moves on these two commodities still move on a revenue-based surcharge because of the shared movement and therefore the shared billing between the various carriers. Consumer and industrial products, our remaining two business units, were not converted to mileage-based based upon customer concerns and customer feedback. And we expect consumer and industrial products to convert to a mileage-based program over time. And if they don't, then we intend to make adjustments to avoid for the potential of over-recovery resulting from the compounding effect of rate increases. Let's actually look at the numbers from BNSF's perspective. And these numbers you can actually tie back to our 10K, which filed with the SEC. And the question is, are we over-recovering? And the answer, no. Not in any year from 2001 to 2005, nor for the 5-year period. And if you see the number up in sort of the upper left-hand corner, you can see that we have under-recovered over that 5-year period by $1.1 billion. Now, this is BNSF fuel expense, absent the hedge, compared to the recoveries from fuel surcharges. Also, some assert that we over-recover in one line of business and in effect subsidize others. And for the 5-year period and for the year 2005, all 4 of our business units fell short of recovering their cost of fuel. 3 of the business units in 2005 recovered a significant amount, i.e. 75% or more of the increase in fuel above base, while coal, the other business unit, recovered well under 50% above its base. So fuel surcharge is clearly not a profit center at BNSF. But as I stated earlier, we will continue to monitor the program and over time do not intend to over-recover while still administering a workable program. And if we find on a business unit basis over time we are over-recovering, we will make adjustments to the program. So in conclusion, BNSF's fuel surcharge was implemented to cover escalating fuel cost. BNSF is not fully recovering fuel cost above the base price. BNSF has reacted to customer concerns in the marketplace, and BNSF believes that a mileage-based fuel surcharge is the most reasonable and appropriate approach. And finally, all of the details of our surcharge program are readily available on our website, bnsf.com. Now that's the end of my slides, but I do have a couple of comments, and I have modified some of the comments that I made based upon some of the testimony that I've heard this morning. But I do want to touch on 2 other points that have been brought up this morning, and I'm sure that they'd be things that are clearly on your mind. You've asked other people questions on them as we've gone through the morning and the early part of the afternoon. First of all, why is the rate on the mileage-based program for grain greater than coal? Let me give you a couple things. First of all, I'll start by saying the mileage-based program has only been in effect for 4 months, so therefore we're still working through what I'll call the startup of a new methodology. But there are clear differences in the business model for coal versus ag. Difference 1, coal moves exclusively in unit train operation. Ag moves some in unit train and some in single car movement. Second is speed. Coal typically moves at the slowest speed on the railroad, while ag moves at a variety of speeds, sometimes depending on which train it's on. And therefore, the higher the speed, typically the more horsepower you have, horsepower being locomotive power, and therefore the more fuel intensity you have. The third activity that causes a difference between the two is switching activities, i.e. activities in the yards where there's fuel being consumed but no real mileage being added. Coal incurs very little switching activity. Ag, especially the non-unit train agricultural movements, incur switching activities. And then finally, weight, which was brought up by one of the individuals earlier, especially on the empty moves, moving the aluminum cars back as opposed to unit grain trains back, clearly causes a difference. So I think really the question is not so much why is coal different than ag, but is ag unit train different than ag single car? And we have one ag rate. We've debated whether we should actually have 2 ag rates, and that's something I think we'll consider in the future. But right now we just have the 1 rates. But those are the differences between coal and ag businesses, which cause ag to be more fuel intensive than coal. The second thing I'd like to comment on is this whole issue of RCAF and rail cost adjustment factor. First of all, we have very few contracts, and I mean we're talking a very small percentage that actually have a full RCAF and a fuel surcharge on them. But from our perspective, RCAF is not really the best recovery methodology and the best match anyway, because RCAF is a nationwide average that doesn't reflect the higher fuel usage of a long-distance carrier like BNSF. And secondly, as was indicated in the last panel, the weights aren't necessarily reflective of the current weighting of fuel cost, especially for a long-haul carrier like BNSF. It really doesn't reflect the volatility and the quickness of the movement. Then thirdly, there are timing differences and estimation differences that the previous panels have talked about. And finally, many of our contracts only provide for a % recovery of RCAF as opposed to full RCAF. And so when you add all that up, RCAF has woefully under-recovered for us. And we don't believe that there should be any double counting here at all. Actually, we believe the best model should be a mileage-based fuel surcharge coupled with an index that I describe as an all-inclusive less fuel index, which would be RCAF absent fuel. And we think that's the best model, and that would really be would address the concerns of most of the parties that spoke on that topic today. So that's the extent of my prepared comments. I'd be ready to answer questions unless you want to ask questions as a panel.
We're not going to do a panel. We'll
Okay.
just ask the questions individually.
That'd be just fine.
There's been a lot made about who's paying this and who's not paying this. We've heard little bit of everything, really. Do you have any idea what percentage of your traffic is not paying the fuel charge because there's a contract or for some other reason?
We disclose our effectiveness rate, and we did it on the last analyst call, at around 75%, expecting we'll be about 80% by the end of this year. As I indicated, through 2005, the business units that clearly had fairly high recovery were ag, industrial, and consumer products. Coal is the one that clearly is significantly under recovering.
And
that's because of contracts.
And you can unequivocally state for us today that the fuel increase that you're trying to recover is not the fuel increase that you're losing under contract.
Are you saying a cross-subsidy between the two?
Right.
No, each of the business units, and again, from my perspective, we're looking at this on a business unit by business unit basis. Each one of them under-recovered last year.
Across the board?
Yes, all 4 business units.
Okay. If the indexing methodology that might be adopted in the future was something other than what you're using today, what would you recommend as an alternative?
I think something that has a high correlation to the fuel we consume, and that, remember the slide that showed the 2 lines going in parallel, something that has a high correlation. And if it was something that actually was an off-highway diesel fuel that was a published statistic, I think there's 2 things that have to be there: high correlation and public visibility. And as long as we find something like that, I think it's fine. I think pure oil is not the best because it doesn't include the refining component.
Thank you. If your company began to view the RCAF as an inadequate method by which to recapture the increased fuel costs, couldn't you have petitioned the board for a change in the way RCAF is calculated?
I imagine we could have. That's probably a bit of I'll say almost a regulatory question, and I'm not a regulatory attorney. What we have done is we have calculated an index that essentially mirrors RCAF and therefore is the all-inclusive less fuel, and then put the fuel surcharge with that. And that's what, in most of our contracts that are coming up, that's what we actually are using.
So you have the RCAF with the fuel taken out of it,
correct,
and then put on the surcharge. So,
correct.
In your estimation, you're not double dipping in any of these contracts.
That's correct. And as I said before, there are a very small percentage of contracts that have, I'll say, a full RCAF and a fuel surcharge, and that's been. That was known at the time we negotiated the contracts with the customers, and that's a small percentage.
There's been some charge that the fuel surcharge program does not account for efficiency gains, that the railroads have achieved tremendous efficiency gains as they're putting in newer locomotives, replacing the older, less fuel-efficient ones. Is there any way to factor in the fuel efficiency gains, or do you think that that's being done?
I think over time that needs to be accounted for. I would also say that fuel efficiency is something that moves at almost a fairly glacial pace. A 1% improvement in efficiency in a year is a big deal. So it's the locomotives. If you think about the turnover in the fleet, we've got over 5,000 over-the-road locomotives on our property, and probably over 6,000 in total, counting the road switchers and all that. And in a big year, we get 300 new ones. So it moves at a slow pace. Over time, if we achieve significant efficiency, we should be adjusting the program to reflect that.
You can understand how the shippers feel, though, in the sense that some shippers feel that, look, you've signed these contracts with other shippers and where you've agreed to not levy any fuel surcharges, and now you're coming to us to raise our rates effectively or institute these practices for us to cover their costs. You can see why the shippers would consider this to be unfair, that if you made these deals and you signed these contracts, why shouldn't you bear the burden of the errors in signing contracts that don't allow you to recover all your costs?
And I'd say we do bear the burden of that. That's why in my comments earlier I said coal was recovering well less than 50%. The place where we have contracts that are longer term, where we've not had, I'll say, a rollover and therefore an opportunity to negotiate a fuel surcharge, is really in coal, and that's where we are under recovering. And when we think about the fuel surcharge, I talked about a 75% effectiveness, but the vast majority of that 25% difference exists within the coal business group. So I think we are absorbing that.
In one of your charts, the bar chart, you had the. Let's see what happened to that thing here.
Can you just go page back?
Yep, I will.
Just on the keyboard.
In the bar chart, you had this.
There we go.
This one?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's it. And the title is Cumulative Under Recovery. Let's see here. Yes, fuel expense above threshold. What is the threshold?
That's, well, I'll give you the exact
Is it-
answer.
is
It's
that
73 cents BNSF, or it's $1.25 highway diesel fuel.
And that's 2001 based?
Yeah, it's
I was trying to figure out why you use the word threshold instead of a particular time or a particular number. That's
because our surcharge program is the same for all customers, and it's highway diesel fuel, and then it runs off of, starts at $1.25 and ratchets up from there.
it's been suggested that off-highway diesel fuel would be better because it doesn't take into account a lot of the other charges that are put on highway diesel fuel. How do you feel about that?
Back to the question earlier, I think as long as we find an index that has a high correlation to what we burn and is publicly available and agreeable to all parties, I'd have no problem with that.
Thank you.
I don't have anything else.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Canadian National. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. For the record, my name is Jim Foote. I'm the Executive Vice President, Sales and Marketing with Canadian National. With me today is Jean-Jacques Rouet, who is CN's Senior Marketing Officer. I'd like to just go through some very, very brief remarks as we have already provided our written comments and answer any questions that you might have. In 2000, faced with the rising fuel costs, CN, as did all other companies, began to look for ways to reduce the exorbitant expense we were faced with rising diesel fuel, and a surcharge was looked at as a way to do this. Our main focus at that time was, number one, that whatever we do be fair. Two, that it be easy to understand. Three, that it be easy to administer, and four, that it not be a profit center. We implemented our first fuel surcharge in 2001 with our CN tariff 7400. The starting application of that fuel surcharge at that time was when the price was $24 WTI. We adjusted that quarterly based on the cost of WTI, and we adjusted the fuel surcharge up 2% for every increase of $5 in WTI. We kept that fuel surcharge in place for a number of years until after further evaluation in the spring of 2005, we introduced a new fuel surcharge. That fuel surcharge starts applying at $25 a barrel WTI versus the $24. It is adjusted monthly. Based on the average price of WTI. The initial charge is 1.5% instead of the original 2%, and each increase in $1 of WTI would take up the price curve on the fuel surcharge of 0.3%. That was a 25% reduction in our fuel surcharge. Again, in 2005, in the fall, we reduced our fuel surcharge tariff again, this time another 16%. Same starting point, $25, same monthly adjustment, same initial 1.5% application, but we were able to reduce the curve from 0.3% to 0.25% for each increase in the price of dollar of WTI. How have we been able to do this? We've worked extremely hard to have universal application of our fuel surcharge. 87% of our eligible customers pay the tariff fuel surcharge. The other remainder have other recovery mechanisms in there for fuel, primarily based on the legacy language in their contracts. By focusing on universal application of this fuel surcharge, we've been able to reduce what today at $70 a barrel would have been a 20% fuel surcharge down to 12.75. In conclusion, we have focused on simplicity. We have focused on universal application. We have been flexible and made changes where we thought it was appropriate. Most of all, we have been fair. We have not over-recovered. If the circumstances dictate that we should reduce the fuel surcharge again, we would do so. Thank you. Answer any questions you might have.
You want to go first?
Thank you. You said that 87% of eligible customers pay the fuel surcharge. What is the population of ineligible customers?
It is about 3% of our business, which is regulated Canadian grain.
I see, okay. So then you don't have a lot of contracts which preclude charging?
Basically, the remaining 13%.
And most of those are subject to the RCAF?
No, they would have other fuel mechanisms in them.
Other fuel, okay.
Contractual fuel.
Contractual
Correct.
fuel.
Yeah, escalation clauses.
Correct.
Yeah,
Okay.
or limitations thereof.
Yes, some tied to WTI, some tied to just CPI. You know, they're all over the place, and we're trying to clean those up as well.
Have you been successful then in recapturing, say, all your increased costs of fuel since the run-up in fuel costs began through your fuel surcharge program?
We are at that point now.
Okay. Does your fuel surcharge program account for fuel efficiency gains, or do you have any way of approaching the way of factoring in fuel efficiency gains?
We would look at our entire fuel expense, and if we thought that it was appropriate or we were getting to the point where we were overcharging in any way, shape, or form, we would adjust it to take that into consideration.
Okay. That's all I have, really.
What part of the elements of your program do you get the most pushback from your customers? I'm just curious.
All of them.
All of them?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, it is what it is. I mean, it's an increase in their transportation cost. I mean, there's no way around it. One of the things we've
It's not
tried.
the index, or nothing stands out as being a particular problem. It's everything.
And it's just the number one. In order to get universal application, and you've heard that today here, we've had to be very arbitrary about the fact that everybody pays it. Some people don't like that. But that's the only way you can drive down the cost is by spreading it across the entire base, and that's the position we took from day one. Secondly, if you look at our freight rate increases during the same period of time, I think our general freight rate increases have been lower than the average during this period as well. So we've tried to be reasonable in the imposition of what has been viewed by some as a hard line that we've taken on this.
And you can unequivocally state for the record that you're not over-recovering your fuel costs.
That's correct.
Okay. Your other Canadian railroad will be testifying here in a moment, and the witnesses are sitting real close behind you there, so I just want to let you know that they're right there. I was going to ask you a question.
Very cognizant of that.
How does your program compare to your other Canadian competitor in terms of your percentages and how it's been received?
To the best of my recollection, to the best of my knowledge, I think in terms of what we base it on and the application, et cetera, it's a reasonably similar program. We have a higher level of application, higher number of customers paying it than I think most do. Again, that's not necessarily applicable just in fuel surcharge. We take that position in just about every chargeable service that we have, and have a reputation, unfortunately, for being arbitrary sometimes in those too. But whatever charge we have, we try to not discriminate and have across the board application. I think CP's coverage, at least from what I see from the published reports, is slightly lower. I don't know why. They have a much bigger coal hauler. I don't know the nature of their contracts.
Mm-hmm.
You also use West Texas Intermediate as the base for your rates for bigger
Correct.
changes. How do you feel about moving to something like off-highway diesel fuel index?
Again, you know, the number one factor here is clarity. Does everybody understand it? I mean, everybody knows crude. I mean, you can ask the guy that drove the cab today what the price of crude was, and they'll tell you it's a recognizable index to tie to. You could dream up a market basket of all kinds of factors that great minds would agree was exact, but can you understand it and apply it? So whatever the index that is used, as long as everybody understands it and it doesn't create confusion and more than anything confrontation in the application of it, it is what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The next witnesses will be from Canadian Pacific Railroad. Welcome this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman Budry, Vice Chairman Mulvey. As you know, my name is Marcella Sale, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Sales for the other Canadian railroad, Canadian Pacific Railway. And I'm responsible for all aspects of the company's marketing and sales efforts, which includes our fuel surcharge program. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you here today. Now, my written testimony discusses in some detail the reasons why we found it necessary to add a fuel surcharge to our base rates, the principles that guide our program.
Excuse me just a moment. For some reason, it doesn't seem that your microphone is working very well. It may not be on. It may not be close enough. We should be able to.
Is that better?
That's better.
Thank you.
We should be able to hear you a lot better. Thank you.
So I'll just repeat that last bit. My written testimony discusses in some detail the reasons why CPR has found it necessary to add a fuel surcharge to the base rates, the principles that guide our program, and the manner in which the surcharges are calculated for each of our major U.S. market segments. In my remarks today, I'd like to emphasize 4 points that I believe are critical to understanding our program. First, contrary to some claims being made by some parties, the incremental fuel surcharges collected by CPR have never exceeded the year-over-year increases in the price of diesel fuel. Even with our efforts to expand the program to include all of our business and periodic adjustments to the level of the surcharge, we have consistently under-recovered against the incremental price of fuel. Secondly, CPR does not engage in any practices, such as imposing a fuel surcharge on traffic that is also subject to an RCAF adjustment that might result in double recovery of fuel costs from a particular customer. Third, CPR's policy is that all shippers should share the burden created by skyrocketing fuel prices. We currently apply some form of fuel recovery mechanism to more than 90% of our U.S. business. And we have measures in place to bring the balance of our business into the program as soon as we can. And fourth, CPR's current fuel surcharge program represents a reasonable balance between the goals of having a workable program and allocating the rising price of fuel in a fair or equitable manner. So first, some context. The figures that I'm referring to and in my remarks today are based upon our U.S. operations. I think it's important also to understand that the vast majority of our U.S. business that I refer to moves under transportation contracts. Thus, all matters relating to price for such movements, including fuel surcharge, are the product of negotiations with our customers. Now, having said that, the fuel cost management is a critical business issue, and fuel is CPR's second largest expense item. In 2005, we spent more than $500 million for fuel, and more than $100 million for our U.S. operations. The extreme volatility of fuel prices represents a serious challenge. In the first 4 months of this year alone, the price of crude oil has increased by about 20%. Therefore, CPR, like virtually every company that consumes fuel and providing services to customers, has found it necessary to add a fuel surcharge. So first, let me address the issue of over-recovery. From the outset, our program has been designed to permit us to recover the increasing price of diesel fuel and nothing more. CPR has never been able to offset fully the year-over-year price increase. Our incremental fuel surcharge revenue during 2005 covered only 80% of the incremental price increase from 04 to 05. Looking further back, the fuel surcharge revenue collected in 04 covered only about 50% of the incremental price increase from 03 to 04. So as these figures show, CPR itself is absorbing a substantial share of the economic burden associated with the rising price of fuel. Second, with regard to double recovery, we do not double recover. Some parties have expressed concern that railroads might be double recovering by applying a surcharge on top of other pricing mechanisms that already compensate for changes in fuel. For example, it's been suggested that this occurs where a movement is subject to both a fuel surcharge and a periodic rate increase based on RCAF index, which, as we all know, measures, among other things, the changing cost of fuel. CPR does not engage in these practices. While RCAF-based increases were once a common feature of many of our transportation contracts, in recent years we've moved away from RCAF as a mechanism for recovering incremental fuel costs. Today, with some few exceptions, CPR's fuel surcharge tariffs, not RCAF, provide the mechanism for adjusting the rates paid by our customers to account for the rising fuel prices. Where RCAF-based provisions do remain in a few of our legacy contracts, we do not also impose a fuel surcharge on top on those contracts. It has also been suggested that recent base rate increases reflect some or all of the rising price of fuel. CPR's approach is to use the base price to deal with the marketplace factors of demand and capacity and our investment requirements, while we rely on the surcharges to manage the fuel exposure. For instance, at the beginning of this year, if I'd have tried to enter into a contract with my customer to predetermine what the cost of fuel was going to be, I would never have guessed it would have risen 20% in the first quarter. So we try to manage that separately. Now, third, a broad program. Like other railroads, CPR faced limitations on its ability to impose fuel surcharges on all customers during the initial stages of its program. Now, CPR has a policy requiring that all new transportation contracts or rate quotations incorporate fuel recovery specifically. I've personally issued strict instructions to all of our marketing managers that this policy be applied to all customers. As a result, we now collect some form of fuel recovery in connection with more than 90% of our U.S. business. As older contracts expire, our goal is that no shipper receives a free ride at the expense of others. Fourth, CPR's program strikes a reasonable balance. Concerns have been raised about whether the methods used by railroads to calculate their fuel surcharges are fair to all shippers. And naturally, no shipper wants to pay more than its fair share of the skyrocketing cost of diesel fuel. We understand these concerns, and we do not claim that our fuel surcharge program is perfect in individual application. But given the enormous diversity in the transportation characteristics of the traffic we handle, and the need for a program that is both workable and easy for customers to understand, it is simply not practical for us to tailor the surcharge on every shipment to the exact characteristics of that shipment. As other railroads, we handle hundreds of thousands of combinations of commodities, car types, weights, distances, terrain, speeds, and other factors that affect fuel consumption. Trying to calculate a specific fuel surcharge for each one of these movements, much less invoicing thousands of different surcharges accurately, would be extremely burdensome, costly, and I suspect prone to invoicing inaccuracy. And adopting such a complex system would do absolutely nothing to reduce the total amount that CPR must try to collect to offset the rising price of fuel. However, CP's fuel surcharges do reflect to some degree the transportation characteristics of the three broad categories of traffic that we handle: carload, intermodal, and grain. Our decision to express fuel surcharges as a percentage of the freight rate is based on several considerations. First, this is a common practice not only in the railroad industry, but among other transportation providers as well. Second, a fuel surcharge is part of the total freight rate, so linking the surcharge to the base rate is logical. Third, it is simple to calculate and easy to administer. This is especially important in connection with the large volume of CP's traffic that moves on an interline basis. Only a tiny fraction of our traffic, which moves on the Soo Line and the D&H, is actually local business, and I mean a tiny fraction. Much of our U.S. traffic is forwarded from Canada under contracts influenced by the Canadian environment, and much of our traffic requires cooperation with our connecting carriers in the United States. And as the board knows, it's important that interline shipments move as seamlessly as possible. So for CPR and its shippers, it makes sense to use the same percentage-based system as our U.S. connections are using for implementation. Now, we've heard a suggestion here today by a number of people that there might be a simple solution, which is a mileage-based type formula. This might have some appeal, but alone, a mileage-based system is not a silver bullet in this circumstance. I mean, you just have to think about driving. If you're driving the same car with the same weight in the same road with the same weather from here to New York, and you drive at 50 miles an hour versus driving at 70 miles an hour, you're going to have different fuel consumption. Take that very same drive and drive a fuel-efficient Toyota and compare it to, let's say, a Ford Mustang with a high horsepower, you're going to have another completely different fuel usage. So these are characteristics of traffic. So in our case, where we have intermodal traffic, that's a speedy movement, scoots around other trains wherever it can, high horsepower to ton ratio, it in fact has a higher fuel surcharge than our other traffic to account for that type of a characteristic. CP has revised its surcharges several times in response to customer feedback and our assessment of the likelihood that the surcharges will appropriately offset the incremental increase in the price of fuel. For example, recent changes have resulted in lower fuel surcharges for both carload traffic and grain. We are, of course, prepared to consider constructive suggestions for improving our program in ways that would allocate the price equitably while maintaining a system that is administratively workable. So in sum, our fuel recovery program is designed to recover only incremental changes in fuel price in the aggregate. So far, we are not achieving full recovery. Our surcharges may not be perfect in their distribution, but that's the trade-off between a perfect program and one that is workable. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Is your fuel surcharge program you have here in the United States on your U.S. traffic, do you have a similar program or the same type program for Canadian, intra-Canadian traffic, or is it different?
Some of it is different. We have a very specific U.S. ag grain fuel surcharge program, which is different than what we have in Canada.
Could you briefly explain the difference between the two?
Well, we've got first of all, it was implemented much later, and I'm not happy to say that the reason why it was implemented much later is that in the years when we were bringing on our fuel surcharges, we were in a very serious service recovery program with our grain business in the United States, and we just didn't think it was fair to impose a fuel surcharge when our customers were very unhappy, and rightly so, with our service. So number one, it was implemented later, and the rate on the fuel surcharge on grain is lower than all the other programs. For instance, intermodal traffic is 13.25%, and U.S. grain is 9.46%.
But it has the same bases as the United States formula. Your approach methodology is similar for both Canada and the United States.
Same methodology we use on highway diesel price in the United States. We use a WTI plus a crack spread in Canada.
Okay. You say that a mileage-based rate would not be a silver bullet, if you like, as someone else has said. But wouldn't a mileage-based rate, with some adjustments, still be would still more closely reflect cost differences than a rate-based rate? Easy for me to say.
So long as you were able to construct something that accounted not just for the miles, but accounted for all the other characteristics of a movement, then one might argue that it would appear to be fairer.
Well, you can't account for everything. I don't think it's possible to have a surcharge that would account for all the vagaries of all the differences in all of these shipments, but something that at least captured major differences, like, for example, weight or terrain or things like that. I mean, I have seen the programs that the various railroads have, including CP's, for monitoring traffic, and they are very, very detailed and very, very specific. You can always tell people exactly where their shipment is at any moment in time, or at least within some distance of where it is. And it strikes me that you could construct algorithms which could calculate the fuel surcharge with a little more precision, a little more correlation to the fuel cost than a rate-based one, which is based upon differential pricing.
I suspect you could construct an algorithm for almost anything, and I can assure you that I'm not the person who's going to do that. That's a fair comment, but I do repeat that some of the other characteristics of traffic are significant. A higher speed train that requires greater handling uses significantly more fuel than one that doesn't. And that's a very significant factor. And just because you might know where all your cars are at any given time, it doesn't necessarily mean that correlates to fuel usage.
I meant to calculating what the average speed of that train was going to be and factor that into the into the surcharge in a general way.
Over time, I think I heard you say over time, over, say, the last year or so, or 2 years, you're still recovering only about 80% of your, I think you said 80% of your fuel costs.
Yes, that's right.
The increased fuel costs.
The increase in fuel costs,
Right.
incremental,
Right.
yes.
Okay. And you say that some of that, the reason for that is because some of the people came into the program late, and because some of the people on the, using the service have contracts or other agreements that preclude that. Is that what you were saying?
Well, it was probably a combination of, for instance, when you've got a differential in your fuel surcharge, for instance, less in the ag business, more in the intermodal business, you're always going to have a spread, and it would be unlikely that you would truly recover 100%. Our goal is to ensure that we spread it as equally as we can among our shippers and achieve 100% coverage, so that 100% of our customers are in fact contributing to that fuel surcharge.
I suppose you were here, I don't know whether you were here this morning when we had a lot of shippers coming in and consultants for shippers coming in, and they were basically saying that all the carriers are recovering way above what their increase in fuel costs are. And it's almost like we're talking about apples and oranges. There's a total disconnect here between what the parties and the witnesses have said today. It's difficult to understand that.
It's an accurate observation.
The total disconnect.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, not at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next witness is from Csx Transportation. Welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We have PowerPoint slides, so if you'll give us just a second here.
We're shocked.
Chris Jenkins.
Our technician still here? Okay.
You gentlemen may proceed whenever you're ready.
I have a little problem with PowerPoint.
And I was kidding.
That's right.
Help is on the way.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, I apologize for the delay. My name is Chris Jenkins. I'm the Vice President of Coal and Automotive for CSX Transportation, and I'm accompanied today by Pete Schutz from our Washington office. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you on what's really a critical topic for CSX, and that is the recovery of our fuel costs. And also to talk about how we are going to meet the demands of our customers for more service and more transportation capacity. Pressure's building on us so that we can move more goods efficiently. For the first time in a generation, demand for transportation on CSX has challenged our capacity. Imported goods are flowing at a faster pace. Every manufacturing industry has shown more interest in rail transportation and greater demands for us to get their goods to the distribution and consumption points. Now, to meet those challenges, we've got to expand our physical plant. We're rising to that challenge. In 2001, we spent $1 billion on capital. Same number for 2002, 2003, 2004, and 2005. $1 billion a year, maybe $1.1 billion in 2005. But in 2006, we're going to spend $1.4 billion. And most of that increase is going into capacity expansion projects. On the Chicago to Florida corridor, for example, we're putting in dozens of new passing sidings and extending existing passing sidings on a corridor that has seen no capacity expansion for 50 years. So what does all that have to do with fuel surcharges? Well, the answer is this, that while we are spending more on capital, in this case an increase of about $300 million, shown by the blue bars between 2005 and 2006, we're also spending, or spent in 2005, $614 million more on diesel fuel than we spent in 2001. And we project that in 2006, we'll spend $859 million more on diesel fuel. So unless we can find a good way to recover that increase in fuel costs, we will hurt our ability to make the capital improvements that are so badly needed. I think we're ready. Next slide. Well, here are the numbers. This is our total fuel cost, 2002 through 2005. You can see we spent about $2.8 billion in fuel, and about a third of that, or $1.1 billion, has been due to the increase in cost of fuel from 2001. Well, so what do we do? You know, our view has been that we need to do exactly what other businesses are doing, whether they're airlines, steamship companies, florists. We need a fuel recovery charge. And that really we needed to ask our customers to cover the incremental cost of fuel. Now, I only wish our program was as efficient as has been suggested. It has not been a profit center for us. In fact, we have under-recovered $319 million in fuel over the last 4 years. Stated differently, our incremental cost of fuel exceeded what we recovered in the fuel surcharge by $319 million. All of our figures exclude gains or losses from hedging. We're talking here about pure fuel costs. So $319 million that we have been unable to recover. Now, we're working on this, but the shortfall has a real and tangible effect on our ability to respond to the strong demand for our services. The fuel surcharge program that we've put in place is designed to help us achieve that recovery. We believe it's fair, it's appropriate, and it is consistent with the principles of differential pricing. In our commercial transactions, negotiating the price occurs simultaneously with discussion of the fuel surcharge and all of the other terms and conditions of our contract prices. And in effect, the fuel surcharge is part of the price, part of the rate. What we're trying to do is to distribute as fairly as we can the cost of fuel across our traffic base. And we think price provides a very good mechanism for determining how that allocation should take place. Because price does consider weight and distance. It considers competitive factors. It considers grades, lengths of haul, other operating considerations. Price incorporates an enormous amount of information about a piece of business. The other advantage of using price is that it prevents us from charging a fuel surcharge that's too high on some of the lowest rated business, a surcharge that might drive that business away and give us fewer revenues and carloads to spread our fixed costs over. So, as we go forward, there are a few things to mention. First of all, we think our program is very transparent. It is linked to WTI, which is extremely visible. We publish on our web fairly extensive information about the calculation of the surcharge for the current month as well as for upcoming periods. And it's also the case that as we recover our cumulative losses, we are willing to make adjustments in the program so that it is generating an amount that is consistent with our incremental fuel costs and does not create a over-recovery. We want to be competitive, responsive to customer needs. I want to close just by referring to the point that I made earlier. Our customers want us to move more traffic. We have got to add capacity to do that. And we can only add capacity if we're generating an economic return that allows us to make those investments. And in order to do that, we've got to take care of the challenge presented by high fuel prices. Thank you very much, and I'd be pleased to take any questions you may have.
You said you have $319 million shortfall in full cost recovery.
Yes.
What is that $319 million? What's attributable to that?
Well, the $319 million is basically the difference between the amount that we have spent in fuel above our 2001 costs and what we've gotten back through the fuel surcharge. So we've recovered $319 million less with the fuel surcharge than what we paid out in excess fuel costs. And that is due to the fact that we don't have complete coverage of the fuel surcharge on all of the traffic. We do have contracts, particularly older contracts, that don't contain fuel surcharge provisions. And we're working, as those contracts come up for renewal, to get fuel surcharge coverage and broaden the coverage to the point where we get just about all the traffic included.
Do you have any idea why there's such a total disconnect between what you're saying and what all the other witnesses this morning were saying?
I am very sure our numbers are correct and that we know what we have spent on fuel in an incremental sense, and we know what we've brought in on the surcharge. And so I can't really address how their computations were done, but we are very sure that ours are correct.
And they seem to be very sure that theirs are correct.
There is a difference of opinion.
Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but nobody's entitled to their own facts.
As Disraeli says, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So, not sure what we have here, but Mr. Buttrey is right. I mean, there should be facts here, this should be knowable, this should be calculable somehow or another. Let me ask you a couple of questions. You said that you're not recovering all of your fuel surcharges. Some contracts don't allow them. Do you have some, and you said that you had a $320 million shortfall over the period. Do any of your contracts have RCAF provisions in them which would factor in some of the fuel increases?
Yes.
So that at least some of it would be, so your shortfall is just the difference between the increased price of fuel and what you recovered through surcharges.
That's correct.
But then you've also recovered some of it through an RCAF.
There is RCAF that applies on some of the contracts, but I would point out that there are many of the contracts that do not have RCAF, or many that have RCAF, but it is subject to a annual cap of 1% or 2%, or it's 50% of RCAF. There are a lot of things that mean that we don't have pure RCAF on contracts.
Would it be possible to tease out what percent of your increased revenues from the RCAF would be attributable to increased prices of fuel that have been factored into that?
I think that theoretically that's possible. It would be analytically quite challenging because we're dealing with several thousand contracts, but in theory at least that's possible.
Okay. Your statement, unlike all the other statements, was one of the few that took on the issue of rate versus practice debate,
Yes.
or at least took it on from the standpoint of arguing that it was a rate rather than a practice. I'd like to explore that with you a little bit through a hypothetical. What if a complaint is filed under 11701A, and which the overall freight rate is not discussed, unlike the previous case that's been cited? Only the mechanism for recovering the fuel component is at issue, and that mechanism is found to be defective on its face. If the railroad has alternative approaches readily available for recouping its increased fuel costs, let's say a mileage-based rate, and let's say the one that's challenged is a rate-based surcharge, and if the board finds that employing an across-the-board percentage fuel surcharge is unreasonable in light of the rail transportation policy, then is there a reasonable possibility or probability that the board could strike down the fuel surcharges as an unreasonable practice, in your opinion?
Well, I can't express a legal opinion on what falls within or outside the board's jurisdiction, but I can suggest a couple things. One is that I have been in the commercial side of CSX for almost 24 years, just coming up on 24 years. And in that period of time, I've been involved with hundreds of contract negotiations. And as we got into the fuel surcharge era, it became very clear that this is one of the items that is part of the negotiation with that customer. And the inclusion of a fuel surcharge in a contract may in fact change what the base rate is. It may change the term of the contract. It can have many, many implications that are linked directly to price or to other terms and conditions in the contract. So we find that separating the two as a practical matter is not consistent with what happens with our customers in our bargaining sessions.
But say the demurrage rates and demurrage rules, that would also be part of a contract, correct? And that clearly is a practice rather than a rate.
In some cases, demurrage would be embedded in the transportation contract. In many cases, demurrage is separate from the transportation contract.
Thank you.
I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next panel is from Norfolk Southern.
Good afternoon.
Sir. Nice to have you here. You may proceed whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Buttrey and Vice Chairman Mulvey. It's good to be here, and I certainly understand the interest in the hearing today. Everyone has an increased interest in fuel charges, the cost of fuel, and the impact on us individually as well as the economy. I've got 6 basic points that I'm going to go through, and I'll be glad to elaborate on these 6 points. First, like everyone else, Norfolk Southern has struggled to really adapt to changing fuel costs and the price of oil. This is not a recent phenomenon, but something that we've dealt with since 2000 and beyond that. It is something that we continue to look at, and when we look at forecasts that EIA and others have put out since 2000, it's very clear that no one had the clear forecasting capability to identify what crude oil or derivative prices would be in the next 6 months, particularly starting in 2003. We had some relative stability of cost from 2000 to 2003, but from 2003 till today, it's been very volatile. Second, because of that volatility, Norfolk Southern has adopted 3 different versions of fuel surcharges since 2000. The original one in 2000, we modified that program again in March of 2004, and we announced a third modification April 24th to apply July 1st of 2006. We'll continue to look at the formulas to try to adapt to what we see as a very volatile, unpredictable situation. Third, we're looking at the oil market like everyone else, and I have to say that when I put my hat on in our company, and I'm Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer for the record for Norfolk Southern, I wish I could sit here and tell you that I predicted the type of freight demand that we're seeing today, that we saw in 2005, and that we saw in 2004. My hindsight is 100%, but my forecasting capability on that demand was not very good. The same shortfall in terms of our forecasting capability came into play with respect to crude oil. But with that said, we're going to continue to monitor it, and we will continue to modify our program as we go forward, as we see fit in terms of the market itself and the cost of oil. The fourth primary point that I want to make is that, and it relates to the forecast that I just mentioned, our traffic at Norfolk Southern continues to grow, and it's grown since 14% since 2000, since the inception of our first fuel surcharge program, against a low-tech industrial production growth rate of 1%. So as we have assessed fuel and we've assessed price together in the marketplace over that period of time, our demand numbers and our volume numbers show that we are competitive in the marketplace, and the demand continues even today. In the first quarter of 2006, our volume was up 5%. For 2004, it was up another 4% for 2005. So continuing demand, and it appears that the combination of price and fuel surcharge is effective in the marketplace. It's value to the customer. The fifth point is that we price to the market. We look at market factors in terms of determining our price for all of our services. Fuel is a component of that market price. When I look at our fuel surcharge at Norfolk Southern, speaking just for our company, I see a 3-legged stool. First is a partial cost recovery. The second leg is a market-based component that is brought about by negotiations in the marketplace. And then the third is it reflects the efficiency of rail. The fuel surcharge has become a reflection of rail's competitive advantage in the marketplace vis-a-vis fuel efficiency. So all 3 of those factors converge into market-based pricing, including fuel. The sixth point is that we must continue to price to the market at Norfolk Southern to be able to enhance the capacity to meet the demand that we're seeing. Our capital budget this year is $1,146,000,000. At the end of this year, and in a 4-year hiring period, we will have hired 8,000 employees, 2,000 employee net gain to the company to handle additional business. We will have spent over $600 million on new locomotives. All of that is to provide service, and these 6 components are the crux of our fuel surcharge application in the market, and we will continue to assess that going forward and do the best we possibly can to make sure that we're matching up total service with value. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Maybe you said this in so many words, but I'm asking every single witness that comes here if you can unequivocally state for the record that you are not over-recovering your fuel surcharge, fuel costs.
we looking over the last 6 years since we've had a fuel surcharge, I can state that we have not over-recovered over that period of time. We continue to work on that. We've got 85% of our revenues now covered by some form of fuel surcharge. The negotiation process is very prevalent in this area. There's a lot of variety to what has been put into place. And over that period of time, on direct diesel fuel, we have under-recovered. And then if we look at diesel fuel, lubricants, and gasoline, that number is larger with respect to the under-recovery.
Have you put a number on the under-recovery?
On the direct diesel fuel expense, starting at our $23 per barrel base
fuel.
in 2000, it's $87 million. And then if you take in gasoline, lubricants, and diesel fuel combined, and we all operate huge fleets of wheeled vehicles to support train service, that number climbs to $233 million.
Okay. Getting back to this rate versus practice debate, is it accurate to say that in the Carolina Power and Light case that Norfolk Southern argued that their fuel surcharge was a separate rule rather than an element in the base rate, and therefore was not an issue in the rate case? Do you recall that?
I do recall that, and I also recall that the other party in the case argued that it was part of the rate.
People do change sides.
Well, you know, at the end of the day, when we look at it, like I described it, the three-legged stool, it's difficult to pull off one leg of the stool and sit in it.
Have you any estimates of what portion of your traffic is not covered by fuel surcharges? Will you have contracts that precluded, or?
We estimate 85% of our revenue base is covered by some variation of fuel surcharge, of some fuel. And with respect to RCAF, what we have generally been doing is take a percentage out of RCAF before we apply some variation of fuel. Most of that's in negotiation, and the consummation of the deal that's done is part of that agreement.
So it's RCAF minus fuel, then the fuel surcharge?
That's correct.
So you would argue that you're not over-recovering from the fuel surcharge program, not over-recovering from double dipping, as they say?
We do our absolute best to ensure that that does not incur.
Let's see here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next witness is from Union Pacific. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. We got a PowerPoint as well. Great, we're quick here. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Knight. With me is Mike Rock from our Washington office. I am the Chief Financial Officer at Union Pacific. During my 25-year career at the railroad, I have also held positions as Vice President General Manager of both our energy and our automotive groups. I've had a chance to listen to both our customers and our shareholders, which has given me a unique perspective on our fuel surcharge initiatives. The board has seen my written testimony, and there's been a great deal of information discussed here already today, so I'll just take a few minutes to summarize Union Pacific's key points. Let me start with a very basic business principle. To stay in business and continue to serve our customers, we must generate enough revenue to cover the cost of doing business. This is as true for Union Pacific Railroad as it is for any other business in America, and fuel is a major cost for Union Pacific. In fact, we are one of the largest consumers of diesel fuel in North America. In 2005, we used 1.35 billion gallons of diesel. We paid $2.4 billion for that fuel, and another $150 million in other fuel-related costs such as utilities, gasoline, lubricants, and other fuels. As we all know, fuel prices have risen dramatically in recent years, and higher fuel prices have clearly not been a positive for Union Pacific. Nobody likes high fuel prices. They are a tax on the economy and a tax on the national productivity. We see the impact in our own personal lives as we fill up at the gas pump. When Union Pacific filled up at the gas pump last year, it cost us about $1.4 billion more in locomotive diesel fuel alone than it cost us in 2002. That's a 150% increase and a serious financial headwind to overcome. Given the significant impact of higher fuel costs on our company, we have worked aggressively to reduce our overall fuel consumption. Since 2000, we have acquired nearly 2,700 new fuel-efficient locomotives at a cost of over $3.5 billion. Last year, we started taking the first of 180 new hybrid low-emission yard locomotives, and we've initiated several changes to our operating practices that have reduced fuel usage. As a result of these efforts, we have improved our overall fuel consumption by 7% since 2000, while growing our traffic volumes by about 7% over the same time frame. Union Pacific does not consume as much fuel as it would without these efforts. However, our fuel costs have continued to climb. Over the 10 years between 1992 and 2002, our diesel fuel prices remained fairly constant, averaging below 75 cents per gallon of diesel. In 2002, it averaged about 73 cents a gallon, and our fuel and utility costs made up only 12% of our total operating expenses. By 2005, that percentage had almost doubled to 22% of our total operating expenses. Diesel fuel averaged $1.77 per gallon last year, and in 2006 is up around $2.20 a gallon diesel. This rapid, disproportionate rise in fuel price is what ultimately led Union Pacific to initiate our fuel surcharge program in 2002. It wasn't clear to us how long or how high fuel prices would rise, but it was clear that we needed to recover this huge and growing cost of doing business. Our early attempts at a surcharge weren't very sophisticated, but over time, based on comments and suggestions from our customers, we've modified and improved the surcharge program. We've developed a process that, 1, reflects the general fuel price trend, 2, is easy to understand, and 3, is easy to administer for both our customers and for Union Pacific. We've set the 75 cent per gallon UP historical average as our baseline. We've linked our surcharge program to the published DOE on-highway diesel fuel index, which is independently calculated and used widely within the transportation industry. This index is easily accessible, and as you can see on the slide, is well coordinated and correlated to Union Pacific's fuel price. Our goal has been to recover 100% of the incremental fuel cost above the baseline. We're not there yet. In a perfect world, 100% of our incremental fuel cost would be recovered from 100% of our customers. In the real world, however, this has not been the case. We are including fuel surcharge provisions in all new price documents. However, we have commercial relationships with some of our customers, both large and small, that have developed over time. Contracts already in place with these customers have prevented us from implementing a surcharge on their business thus far. As fuel costs have risen dramatically over the past few years, our surcharge recovery has increased as well, but so has the amount of incremental fuel cost not recovered. As you can see on this slide, as indicated by the green bar, since 2003, these unrecovered costs have totaled over $800 million, but we are making progress. In 2005, we recovered about 74% of the incremental cost. This year, we expect our surcharges to recover about 90% of the incremental fuel cost from about 90% of our revenue base, much closer to our goal of 100% recovery. In the first quarter of this year, our total diesel fuel costs increased by about $150 million over the already high cost level of the first quarter of 2005. Our first quarter surcharge recovery increased about $190 million year over year. This has caused some to conclude, erroneously, that we recovered more than 100% of our incremental fuel cost. This is just bad math. In fact, in the first quarter of this year, we spent almost $400 million in incremental fuel costs above the historical 75 cent per gallon level. We recovered about 90% of that increment in the first quarter. This is about $190 million more than we recovered in 2005, but still less than the total incremental cost. On the surface, the concept of a fuel surcharge seems fairly straightforward, but the deeper you get into the details, the more complex it becomes, as we've heard today. To actually determine the exact fuel cost incurred by every customer on each move would involve factors, as we've talked all day, including weight, distance, terrain, weather conditions, equipment type, and other factors. This would be hopelessly complicated, enormously time-consuming, and administratively costly for both our customers and our company. We've learned a great deal over the past years as we've worked with our customers and developed a better understanding of the surcharge process. In fact, as I mentioned, our current program reflects modifications from the original mechanisms in response to customer feedback. We're also learning from comments and suggestions generated by this hearing, and there may be further modifications and improvements to be made. In any event, it will be critical that our surcharge program enables Union Pacific to fully recover its cost of fuel. It must be responsive to customers, it must be equitable, and still be easy to administer for both Union Pacific and our customers. As I stated at the beginning of my remarks, Union Pacific must recover its costs of doing business if it intends to stay in business for the long term. Our customers are relying on us to be there for the future, to meet their needs and invest for their growth. By the end of this year, Union Pacific will have invested nearly $26 billion in its rail network since 1996. This includes nearly $2.8 billion in 2006, and we expect to continue investing in the future. But we are relying on private investments in private right-of-way, and we can only do that if our returns exceed the cost of that invested capital. In recent years, Union Pacific has not earned a sufficient return to meet, let alone exceed, its cost of capital, as our shareholders and our investors require. In fact, our return on investment in 2005 was only 6.3% using the STB methodology as indicated on the chart here, which is well below the STB estimated cost of capital at around 10%. Unrecovered fuel costs put additional pressure on those financial returns and impair our ability to meet the increased demands for rail transportation in the years ahead. The bottom line, Union Pacific isn't in the business of trying to make money from our fuel surcharge program. We're in the business of making a fair return by offering valued railroad services to our customers. In order to do this, to stay viable as a company and to reinvest for the long term, it is absolutely essential that our revenues cover our costs of doing business, and that includes the unpredictable cost of fuel. Thank you.
The claim has been made, certainly made all morning this morning anyway, that your company and others is making up their loss on their contract business, on their tariff business. Mm-hmm. What is your response to that claim?
I would respond by saying that for Union Pacific in the first quarter, and we expect for 2006 in total, our recovery above that threshold, we expect to be about 90%, and the total revenue base that will contribute towards that recovery also is 90%. So there's still some business out there that we need to tap into as those contracts term, and every new price document we put in place will have a fuel recovery. But our 90% recovery being generated by 90% in aggregate fits in squares.
What percentage of your traffic is not covered by fuel surcharges because of contracts? Do you know?
Well, it'll be roughly the remaining 10% that doesn't have some sort of a fuel surcharge.
Only about 10% is not.
Yeah, yes. And there's a variety of coverage rates within that 90% that does have some sort of a fuel surcharge, but only 10% roughly would have nothing at this point in time.
Yeah, I had heard that there were some contracts that were pretty long-lived yet that still had these clauses in them, and it'd be a long time before they could be renegotiated.
And that is true.
Okay. How do you buy your fuel? Do you buy mostly wholesale, or you buy mostly wholesale in bulk, right?
That's right.
Of course.
Right.
And but you use the basically a different. You don't use the off-highway rate. You use the on-highway rate. Some argue that the off-highway rate will be more closely tied to the actual rate that you're paying for fuel for the base rate.
Right. I've heard that today, and in fact, in our case, as I showed on one of my charts, the correlation between the DOE on highway to the price that we actually pay is very well correlated. I mean, it's a very high correlation rate. So in our case, we think that correlation exists with the on-highway pricing. I can't speak to the off-highway. Is it a better, tighter correlation? Frankly, I doubt it's any tighter, but perhaps it could be another way of looking at it.
You began your testimony discussing the greatly improved fuel efficiency of your locomotive fleet, a 7% reduction in improvement in fuel efficiency over the last 6 years or so. Is that factored at all into your calculation of the fuel surcharge?
It is. When we look at establishing the rate that we're going to apply on the surcharge, we take into consideration what we actually are spending. So the fact that we are doing things more fuel efficient does go into the mix in terms of setting the rate.
And finally, it's been argued that the RCAF might be a fairer way of calculating fuel recovery than using a fuel surcharge. Would you think that getting rid of the fuel surcharges and just relying upon RCAF would be a way of capturing the same proportion of your costs through that you are now?
Possibly, but I think as you heard today, I think there's some adjustments that would have to be looked at with RCAF. The biggest one, frankly, is the lead time. I think as we talked today, or you spoke earlier today, the RCAF is about a 12% recovery, and today our actual fuel expense is closer to 22% of our operating expense. So you've got that long lead time. So, and there are other inherent issues I suspect that customers, if they all were looking at RCAF, might find across the entire spectrum of customers.
Well, we adjust the weights periodically. We could
Right.
adjust the weights again as a starting point for this. And then, of course, fuel data from the AAR is available on a monthly basis. And perhaps we could have a new RCAF which will come out monthly, just reflecting the fuel, and then one that comes out quarterly reflecting all the other components. But
I think one of the keys would be to be transparent and be something that not only the rails but also the customer base could readily access and see in the marketplace, and not something confusing that they would be a bit of a mystery to them as to how that was calculated. And that's the beauty, in my mind, of the DOE on highway diesel fuel price. It's an index that is readily available. It's not railroad owned or railroad generated. It's out there for everybody to see, and there's no debate over what that number is.
thank you.
There was a lot of testimony this morning about the difference between what grain shippers pay and what coal shippers pay. The grain shippers testified that they were getting a much worse deal, if you will, than the coal shippers are. I wonder if you have any response to that.
I don't, and we assess our fuel surcharge on as a percentage of rate, so that particular argument I think applied to more of a mileage-based rate. But I think one of the comments that was made earlier, which I think is a true statement, is that with coal, you are generally talking about unit coal trains. I mean, all of that business moves in efficient
But
unit
aren't
coal
you also
trains.
talking about unit trains when you're talking about grain?
Well, with grain, you have a large portion of unit train business, but you have other business in the grain markets that doesn't move as efficiently in unit train business. You have shuttle trains, and you have yet even smaller cuts as well. So I don't have a strong opinion in terms of the differences between the ag and coal markets.
Questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We were conferring about what our schedule would be, and we're going to take the next witness, then we're going to take about a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and have the consultant panel. So proceed when you're ready, sir.
Good afternoon,